All right, so let's finish up water and sustainability. First, we're going to go over water, the Bolivian water wars and water privatization. So first things first, we want to kind of figure out what does it mean to privatize something. So this is a common occurrence, and privatization refers to when something goes from public ownership to private ownership. Usually, this means it goes from government hands, whether it's a local park or a national forest or a state-owned fill in the blank. It goes from a government-owned thing to private hands. So private is either going to be an individual or usually a corporation. And so it basically goes from owned by the people, so to speak, to owned by an individual. Okay, so this happens for any number of natural resources, land, water sources, energy resources, and so forth. Um, so there are, if you look at the research, I mean, there are some benefits of privatization. So generally speaking, governments, they're not known for their efficiency. There's very good reason for that. Governments tend to be pretty inefficient. Um, so once a resource is privatized, it tends to be managed more efficiently, which this all boils down to making a profit, right? So if you buy, let's say I buy a piece of land from, I buy a local state park, and then I own it, but I paid for the whole thing. I mean, it's generally speaking, unless I'm a completely altruistic and I'm doing it for charitable purposes, more likely than not, I'm buying it because I want to make some money off it. It's an investment for me. And so, generally speaking, when something is privatized, it does tend to be used more efficiently and profit tends to increase. If you recall from our Tragedy of the Commons back in our um, earlier lesson, if we recall, privatization was actually a way that we could avoid tragedy of the commons. So remember, tragedy of the commons is based on the premise that it's owned by the community and nobody sort of is in charge of that resource. So if you think back to the farm field that everyone was grazing their cattle on, from the example from the reading, a privatization would be somebody or some corporation or other entity goes in and buys that whole resource. And so if you can do that, if the owner of the resource wants to sustain or maintain that source indefinitely, because they have total control over that resource, that they're able to do that. So if I bought a piece of land from the government, I said, you know what, I don't want this, I want to keep this going on forever. I want to sustain it because because I own it, I can dictate what happens to it, and so um, I can sustain it over time. Okay, so it's possible, but doesn't always happen. So some of the drawbacks, um, when something goes from a government owned to or a government run to privately run, I mean, part of this efficiency increase tends to be fewer jobs. Okay, so there's a flip side to efficiency. It's maybe not always the best thing. It's great to use a resource more efficiently and increase profits, but it can and often does result in job loss. So if you have something that's inexpensive or free, at least you don't have to pay for it to access it, like a public park, for example, and then it goes to private hands and they want to make money off of it, so they start charging money for it. Well, all of a sudden, it's possible that people that could afford it before can't afford it now, and that it could be something that was relatively inexpensive that became more expensive, and you read a couple of examples of that in this week's lesson. So the inequity side of things can tend to increase. Environmental degradation does often occur. It's a little, it can be easier to exploit the resources. So if you have publicly owned land, think of a national park where it's it's used, and there companies can go in and lease the land, and maybe they can mine for minerals and maybe harvest some of the timber and so forth. Um, but because when the government's in control, it tends to be more managed, and one of the goals of government ownership is usually to keep it in the hands of the people forever. So you think of our national parks. I mean, the government's one of their jobs is to keep that national park going in perpetuity. And so if you privatize that, it can and often does end up with a little more environmental degradation, and generally speaking, just exploitation is something that's pretty common as well. All right, so let's take a look at what happened in Bolivia. So on April 8th, 2000, 17-year-old Victor Hugo Daza was shot and killed in a protest in Cochabamba, Bolivia. What led to this, sad event? So there was a series of actions that started with the Bolivian government goes into debt. So this happened in 1998. This happens all the time across the world. We have these relatively low-income countries, or a country that used to be doing all right financially, and all of a sudden, something happens and they go into debt. Well, what often happens is an international fund like International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So in this case, the IMF gave the Bolivian government a $138 million loan. However, as one of the conditions of giving them that loan is that they require the privatization of public industries, including the water supply. Um, and so, or the water supply of Cochabamba, which is a town in Bolivia. And so after about a year, it turned out it was kind of like a shady closed door negotiation. The Cochabamba water supply was purchased by this international consortium, which the major investor of that was the Bechtel Corporation in San Francisco, USA. So you had this water supply, water and sewer supply, in this town in Bolivia, and as part of the conditions of this loan from the International Monetary Fund, which is basically an international bank, they had to sell, they had to privatize their water supply, also their energy industry and some other things. So this used to be a publicly owned water supply and sewer system, and it got sold. Okay, got sold, and then lo and behold, the water rates go up 200% to 300%, even though they promised it would only go up, 35% or so. If you remember from the video, people's houses, if they couldn't afford their water bills, so they couldn't send their kids to school, or they weren't eating as much, or they lost their houses. I mean, all these really bad things. So needless to say, that people were not happy. You had some protests, you had some riots, happened over periods of, months. And then on April 8th, this 17-year-old boy was killed when the Bolivian army opened up fire on protesters. So it wasn't sort of a unfortunate incident. It was more something that should never have happened, because you have nonviolent protesters that are being fired upon by someone in the army. And sadly enough, the person that killed Victor Hugo Daza was actually acquitted later on by a military tribunal. So this is the really short synopsis. And what happened after this, very soon after that, on April 10th, the water supply was actually given back to the town. So they were ultimately, the situation was remedied. But this is a pretty notorious event in the history of privatization. It's pretty well known. It happened very recently, at least in the last 15 years, so it's not like ancient history. But this situation in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, it's a little bit of an extreme example. I mean, it's not every time when privatization happens that people die, but often there are riots. But if nothing else, this process is very common. This process is called structural adjustment. And this was mentioned in a previous presentation when we talked about social and environmental justice, and particularly neo-colonialism. And so this whole process, the structural adjustment process, is very common. And here's basically how it works. A country goes into debt. Usually it's almost always a low-income country. If not, it's a country that's in very extreme financial circumstances. So they go into debt. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank offers a loan, but they always have these conditions, and the conditions are the structural adjustment. And so the structural adjustment conditions are that they must change their economy in some way. So the World Bank, which is an international it is an international bank with members from all over the world, usually headed up by the United States. And they say, all right, look, we'll give you money, but in order to do this, in addition to the interest that you're going to owe us, of course, you have to do certain things. And they're going to have to change their economy in some way. And usually what it is they're either required to export more goods and or privatize, usually both. And surprise, surprise, this usually benefits the foreign companies and or governments. So in the case of Cochabamba, the structural adjustment conditions were that they had to privatize their public utilities, basically. And so this is, the result is that people were very unhappy, and this is not an uncommon occurrence. I mean, structural adjustment happens; it still happens to this day, and generally speaking, the people don't end up in really good shape because of that. Okay, so a couple other, I'll go over these privatization examples real quick. This is from a short video. That's a snippet of this movie, Tapped. So if you remember in South Africa, the privatization of the water supply caused a disease outbreak, excuse me. Remember, people couldn't afford the water, so they were drinking from this contaminated water supply that was like contaminated by animal fecal matter. Really bad situation. India, similar thing, privatization, water was too expensive, so you had issues with water shortages. If you remember from an earlier lesson, we talked about how Coca-Cola was sort of exploiting water supplies in India, and the local farmers couldn't afford to water the crops. And of course you had Bolivia. I mean, the situation that we just talked about. So again, generally speaking, privatization does not end up very good for the people. And so what is this? This all boils down to when you sell a public good to a private corporation, you think about why would a corporation buy something? I mean, what's the whole point of a corporation? And they're actually mandated by law to maximize shareholder profits. Okay, so the responsibility of a corporation is to maximize profits. And so when they privatize something, the goal is to make money. I mean, look, this is not. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I mean, you're not going to be in business very long if you're not making money. But this can become an issue if the good that they buy is something that people need to live. And if you remember from the earlier part in the first part of the previous video on water, water is something that's essential for life. It's not like oil. It's not even it's not like copper or even food supplies, which can be substituted for. There's no substitute for water. And so when you have a corporation that they're by law required to maximize the profits for their shareholders, and it's the thing that they buy and that they're trying to make money off of is essential for life, this can become a pretty big deal. And you think about water in general. I mean, water is a major market. If you're like me and you were alive, 30, 35 years ago, and still remember, bottled water was not a thing. I mean, it's just nobody had bottled water, so it's a major market now. And you think about nowadays, if you buy like one of those single serving bottles of water, it's usually more expensive than gasoline, depending on the price of gas. But as I talk about this in 2016, it is definitely more expensive by the bottle than gas. And as they mentioned in that video, the water industry is seen as a major investment opportunity worldwide. And so you see from the World Bank, the estimated world market for water is 800 billion. It's a major, major way for people to make money. So again, nothing wrong with people making money, but it can be an issue if the thing that you're making money off of is absolutely essential for people to survive. I mean, you need it for food, you need it for drinking, you need it for industry, you're generally going to need it for energy production. So yes, there's nothing wrong with sort of exploiting and making investments and making money off of investments, but you have to be careful when it's something is fundamental to survival. So corporations see water as a possibility for profit, not as a fundamental right. So the United Nations has actually declared access to clean water as a fundamental human right, and so it's something I guess worth thinking about when you look at the investment in water as a way to make money internationally. And again, this is all very complicated. There can be benefits to privatization. Let's say the water, if the water is being managed inefficiently and people are wasting water because it's run by the government, sometimes a private corporation can come in and help manage the resource a little more efficiently. But again, generally the problem here is that when you're making an investment, you want to make money off your investment, unless you're running a charity, and so in that case, generally speaking, water becomes less accessible to people. It can become a very big problem. Okay, so this is not just a big international issue. If you recall from the short reading, I'm based on the East Coast near Philadelphia, so this is pretty close. This Coatesville water issue is something that's pretty close to where I am. And if you remember the story here, this is Coatesville, Pennsylvania, up in kind of that, steel mill part, the old industrial part of Pennsylvania. And so they, again, similar situation. They ran into budget problems. And they're like, all right, we're really in trouble here. And so they had a public utility. They own their water and sewer utility. Same situation in Cochabamba, actually. So they sold it to a private investor. So they, this private investor, PA American Water Company, invested this $39 million. And they said, all right, look, I understand people are worried water rates are going to go up. They said, in order to sort of soften the blow, make it a little easier to handle, we're going to freeze the rates for 3 years. Okay, so this happened in, I think, 2001. And so what happened after the so for 3 years, everything was cool. They were making water upgrades and everything. And then what happened after the 3 years? Well, they weren't holding the price of water down anymore, so the average increase, almost 300%. Increase on water bills from 2001 to 2014. So if you remember the example of the woman, her bill went up for $100 a quarter, which is every 3 months, to $100 a month. Okay, so this is pretty common. Again, rates tend to go up, and then all of a sudden people can't really afford their water. Now, to be fair to PAWC, they did make, in addition to the $40 million they paid Coatesville, they made, $160 million. So all combined, they made about $200 million in upgrades. So again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Now the problem is that when people can't afford their water, it becomes a problem. But also remember that this is, as a publicly traded company, they have to pay their investors, right? So they're not only do they have to make their investment back, but they have to pay. People expect a return on their stock price and increased stock prices, so they make money. This is not. I mean, it's sad. A sad story. People get priced out, and all of a sudden they can't afford their water bills. But a situation like this, to be fair, there's not necessarily an easy solution. I mean, if you have a public utility and they don't have enough money to fund, their water provision and their sewage provision, what are they going to do? I mean, they either they're going to have to charge the people more, or they're going to have to shift money from other parts of the budget. So there's not necessarily an easy solution here. So I'm not here to say that privatization is all bad. I mean, these guys made, a couple $100 million of upgrades and so forth, but it can become an issue for sustainability because people can't necessarily afford it. And especially from an equity perspective, where people without, the money, then all of a sudden they can't afford their water. I mean, imagine if you can't afford your water bill. This happened recently in Detroit in 2015, where water rates went so high and they were shutting off people's water, and there was a big hubbub in Detroit because of people like, well, I need water to survive. So, it's not an easy problem, but it is important, I guess, to the point here is that it's important to think about the consequences of doing this kind of privatization and see how the people end up. All right, so shifting gears, we're going to look at really quickly. There was an article about fracking in water, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. Fracking is a big thing, hydraulic fracturing, which is a way to extract oil and natural gas. And so basically what happens is with fracking is you drill a well, you go into a rock layer, and then in order to, this is a shale or otherwise a tight formation that normally you can't get the oil or gas out of. And so what they do is they drill this well in there and they actually pump a water and with some other stuff in it. They pump it down the well at such a high pressure that it actually cracks the rock, so these little fractures. And then you can pull the oil and natural gas out. That's the short story. There's a lot more to it. But the problem here is that each fracked well requires about 5 million gallons of water. So that's an awful lot of water, considering that in 2014 alone, there were over 1 million fracked wells in the United States. This is a major, major, major thing going on in the U.S. Since the early 2000s. And it just keeps increasing. And so if you think about 5 million gallons of water to frack one well, and for 1 million fracked wells, that's 5 trillion gallons of water for those fracked wells on average. And so if you think about the average U.S. person uses about 100 gallons a day. So if you do the math, that's about 150 people for 1 year for one well. It's a significant amount of water. So that situation in Colorado from the article. So you have Colorado over here. Colorado is a very dry, arid or semi-arid, almost a desert. So they don't get a lot of rain. And by the way, this map shows all your sort of areas where there is fracking is possible, and where there's natural oil and natural gas to be extracted through fracking. So it's a major thing, and there are areas worldwide with this. Okay, so in Colorado, basically what's happening is you have these energy companies come in. They say there's all this natural gas we can get out of the ground, but we need all this water. All this is a problem because we need a lot of water, and Colorado does not have a lot of water. And what's happening is the energy companies can offer often up to 100 times. So you have a town that has a water supply, let's say, and they're like, okay, we can take this much from a farmer, or we can get 100 times more from a natural gas or oil company. Economic decision is pretty easy there. Let's take the oil money or the natural gas money. So this ends up with a lot of money for towns, which is good. Budgets go up. You can fund a lot of infrastructure improvements in schools and all that kind of thing. Bad news, farmers can't afford the water. So this is a very common occurrence in that fracking, hydraulic fracturing requires all this water, and there are areas where either people's wells are getting contaminated, which has been shown to happen, or otherwise supplies of water are being used up more quickly. And this is a particular problem when you have these dry parts of the country like western Colorado, where there's a fight between fracking and farming. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I think it's a really interesting issue that's not going away, something to keep your eye on. So if you look at, again, shifting gears a little bit, it's hard. I mean, we only have so much water available to us, and so we have to figure out how we're going to use that water. So if you look at how we're using water in the United States, so these are the different uses, these 8 uses of water. Public supply, which is basically your towns and cities, more or less. Self-supplied domestic is wells. Irrigation is farming. Livestock is livestock. Agriculture is fish growing, fish farms basically. Industrial is industrial facilities, paper factories, whatever, from wells. And you have mining operations, which include fracking, and thermoelectric power, which is power plants. So these are the 8 categories that are in this pie chart. So I want you to press pause and think about which of these do you think takes up which of these slices. So like, is this big slice, is that agriculture? Is it mining, including fracking? Is it the public supply, stuff that cities use? So I want you to think about that and press pause. And here's the actual. So this is the most recent data I could find. It's 2010. This is from the USGS. So this is the millions of gallons per day for each. So it turns out the yellow slice is actually thermoelectric power. So the energy industry is actually the biggest single user of water in the United States. Let me repeat, the energy industry, power production, power plants, coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, natural gas, they are the biggest user of water in the United States. Almost half of the water in the US is used by power plants. And the second biggest one is irrigation, okay? And then the third is this public supply, so that's sort of towns and cities. So that matches up a little bit with the numbers that we've seen earlier in this lesson, except that the irrigation numbers have gone down, because you remember before irrigation was like 40–50% were the numbers that were being quoted. But keep in mind that this is all water, so it's not just fresh water. So this includes salt water, which can't be used for agriculture. So if you actually look at fresh water supplies, then agriculture is actually the biggest user. But I think kind of the point here is that yes, agriculture is a huge user, way outpacing, there's way more than the towns and cities use, but actually energy production is a really important part. So again, energy and water here, they are closely related. There is a water impact or a water footprint of you using a kilowatt hour of electricity. It's something that's important to think about. Okay, so we do need food, but we need energy too. All right, the last little thing. We talked about ocean acidification. This is one of those things that does not get very much press. Not a lot of people know about it, but it is a really, really big problem that's only getting worse. So first of all, what is ocean acidification? It's the acidifying of the ocean. It's a lowering of the pH. This is not dramatic. It's not like the oceans are turning to acid, but they are going from, around neutral to, well, not quite neutral, to a little bit less. So they're a little more acidic. It's just a minor thing, but it is causing problems. So what is causing this is actually the increased carbon dioxide in the air. So it turns out carbon dioxide, I don't know if you remember from our carbon cycle in the climate change lesson, but part of the carbon cycle is the oceans absorb a significant amount of the CO2 from the air. So they're a natural part of the carbon cycle. So the problem is that when you have, as we have increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air, in the atmosphere, the oceans absorb more of it, and that ends up lowering the pH. It creates carbonic acid, and it's just a natural thing that the oceans do. They absorb the CO2, and it lowers the pH of the CO2. All right, so it doesn't sound too great, but what really is the problem here? The big thing here is, one really big thing is that anything that has a calcium shell, like oysters and shellfish, little tiny plankton, really important parts of the fishing industry and also part of the food chain. It's pretty complicated, but basically once you lower the pH, it's harder for them to make their shells. It can also kill other organisms, as they went over in the video, and coral is being compromised in this as well. So coral reefs. So coral reefs, if you notice from the picture here, they're doing a lot of research on coral reefs and ocean acidification. And so this is actually a healthy coral reef, and this is a similar environment but more acidic. And so they actually, there are these underwater vents that emits carbon dioxide underneath the ocean, mimicking this acidic environment. And people are researching to see what happens when the ocean becomes more acidic. And one of the major impacts is it turns out the coral reefs have a really tough time surviving. And this is, bad enough because coral is really, beautiful and everything, but coral is also a major part of the food chain. I mean, there's millions of marine organisms that use coral at some point in their life to live and survive. So this is a really big problem. It's sometimes called the evil twin of climate change, because remember, climate change, as we know it, is probably happening, almost certainly happening, because of the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's important to point out that regardless of whether or not humans are causing climate change, okay, so regardless of whether or not humans are causing climate change, because we're raising the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are lowering the pH of the ocean. So let me repeat, even if the humans are not impacting the climate because of carbon dioxide, no matter what, they are actually acidifying the ocean. Okay, there's nothing you can do about this. When you add more CO2 to the air, it's going to end up making the ocean more acidic. So this is often called the evil twin of climate change, because it usually happens, it's been happening sort of in lockstep with each other. And so this is an issue that I wanted to bring your attention, because it is something that's, it's becoming a little more well known, but it's not as well publicized, but it is potentially extremely important impact of our increased CO2 emissions. Okay, so that includes our lesson on water.